Good evening. I think we're live. I can never tell exactly when we're live. Okay, we are. Um, Welcome once again to Building Your Spiritual Immunity or Build your Spiritual Immunity, as the graphic says over there. And I believe this is session 7. So this has been 7 weeks we've been meeting on Wednesday nights to have this class. I hope you've gotten a lot out of it. I know I have, just preparing for this. And a lot of this is material that I've gone through before with either groups of youth leaders or with students, and all material that I've thought of before. But it's a lot of stuff I've had to kind of look up on my own, so to dig deeper and to see further into different ideas and concepts. So tonight I wanted to do something a little more practical, and even in saying that, even though it's more practical, there's still plenty of really abstract stuff in here. I can't help it. But tonight I hope that you'll be able to use some of what we're going to go over immediately, and perhaps you have teenagers in your life, whether the children or people in your church who have these kinds of questions, or perhaps you have these kinds of questions, or you have good friends that have these questions. But there are two questions we're going to address tonight that I think everyone asks. And part of the reason everyone asks these questions is because they go so against a lot of our inherited values, the values we inherit from our culture. And those two questions are, and I'll phrase these differently throughout the night. If God is good, why is there evil? Why, or why is there suffering, is another way that question is put. And also, if God is loving, then why does he send people to hell? Well, why does God care about sin and hell? And those would be questions that I think maybe throughout history people have had, but I think especially now, those are probably the two most common objections to Christianity specifically. And perhaps the hell question has been phrased different ways. Why is such and such thing a sin? Why would God judge me for this or that? So the idea of God being a judge, the idea of God being arbiter, that you are not the judge, the arbiter, that is a very offensive idea right now, where that idea might not have been very offensive even 100 years ago. Right now, anything that removes our autonomy is seen as threatening. So before we can even get to those kinds of questions, we need to kind of trace back, go back in time, and not figure out where these questions came from, because I think the question of evil has probably been with us as long as people have been alive. The book of Job kind of has that in the background of why do bad things happen to good people. And the book of Job was written thousands of years ago. It was literally written before Genesis. It didn't occur before Genesis, clearly, but it was written down before Genesis. So the book of Job is very old, and some of the earliest writings we have are addressing this issue. But nobody really put it that way. If God is good, why is there evil? Or if there's such thing as divine intervention, why do bad things happen? Nobody really put it like that until a philosopher named Epicurus. And I almost said Epicurious because there's a website called Epicurious that has a bunch of recipes on it. But Epicurus was a philosopher, a Greek philosopher, as they all were. You don't hear about many Hungarian philosophers. Well, maybe there are, but not in ancient world. So this week we are going to talk a little bit about Epicurus first, and then see how his ideas have kind of descended throughout history to the point that you can find them in DC movies. So I'll get to that in a second. That was the teaser for this class tonight. So this week, the problem of evil, what a 2,300-year-old philosopher and DC movies have in common, and also the question of hell. So who's this guy? Greek philosopher from the 3rd century. He was an empiricist. So he would say there's no such thing as divine intervention. The only things that exist are material things, or rather natural things. He might have used different terminology, but that's a very common belief today. That you can only prove the natural, the material. You should only base your life on your sensations, more or less, because scientific method is basically just your 5 senses being put to use. and he was also a hedonist, which hedonism, to the fullest extent, is basically if it feels good, do it. Epicurus wasn't so far that he was just about seeking pleasure, but he was a very ethical person, very moral, and a proponent of noble and just living. Like he said, you should live a noble life. You should try to be just. His reasoning, though, is if you live justly, if you live nobly, then you'll probably have an easier life. You'll have a less burdensome life. So, for example, let's say you're a Machiavellian type, and Machiavelli didn't write for centuries later, but Machiavelli wrote in The Prince. Basically, he said, "Hey, if you want to be a good politician or a leader, you have to give people the impression that you're good, and then just do whatever you want. So cheat and get away with it, and then you'll actually get the most out of life, and you'll be very effective. So basically, convince people that you're moral, and then act immorally." And if there's no God, then who cares? You'll get everything you wanted out of life, and people will think you're great. The problem with that, Epicurus would say, if he were to time travel, would be that for the normal person, and what defines normal, but for the average person, living that kind of life would cause such stress, such a burden on your conscience, having to live a double life, or knowing that you're lying to people, knowing that you're cheating people, that at some point that would get to you. And this is the content of some of Dostoevsky's works. If you've ever read Crime and Punishment, the premise of that book is this is not a spoiler, it's in the first page. The premise of the book is someone who wants to pull off a perfect crime, so he goes and commits a murder, thinking he can get away with it. And the police question him and everything, and he gets away with it. And he's home free, except his conscience gets to him. And he can't help but go and confess. Like, he's trying to fight this urge he has to confess because he knows it'll ruin his life. And Dostoevsky revisits this concept, I believe, in Brothers Karamazov, in the story of this guy who, I remember this vaguely, this guy who is throwing a big party because he wants to confess to all of his friends what a horrible person he actually is. I think it was something like he had been cheating on his wife, cheating people. And he invites, everybody knows him as this really rich guy that's really generous and likes to throw parties. So he invites everybody over, and he, hits his glass, and I need to confess something. And he tells them all this horrible stuff that he's done. And nobody believes him. They all think he's joking. They all think like, "Oh, wow, you're the best. That's great. Way to pull our leg. We know you're a great guy." Which only adds to that person's guilt. The community is letting him get away with it, so to speak, but it just makes him feel worse. So Epicurus says, you should live a good and noble life so you won't be in a situation where you're feeling horrible about yourself. But really the point is so that you live a better life, so that you're happier. Now you can see clearly where this idea, Epicureanism, has arrived at our shores and is basically, what we breathe in the culture right now. If it feels good, do it, but don't overdo it. Everything in moderation, that idea. Or the idea that, you should volunteer because it just makes you feel better. You really feel better about yourself and you're helping your fellow man, and all these reasonings given that are ultimately selfish. But if we're helping people, and who really cares? If people are living a better life, then so what? Now, the enemy of Epicureanism then would be any form of suffering. That's the opposite of what you want. That's the opposite of pleasure and comfort. Suffering is the privation or the removal of pleasure and comfort. So Epicureanism and Epicurus would be very much against suffering. Why would you ever suffer? Why would you ever purposely go into suffering? So Epicurus had a problem with the idea of there being some divine intervention, because why would the divine want there to be suffering? Therefore, Epicurus is an atheist. I don't know if that category would have been applied to him then, but why would there be gods if suffering exists, if evil exists? If they exist, then God can exist. So he also came up with this idea, and this will come up later in tonight's lesson. I just laying the groundwork for where these ideas came from. The tetrapharmakos, which is basically a 4-part remedy. Pharmakos, pharmacy, same idea. And the 4-part remedy is this. And this is what you need to do to live a better life, according to Epicurus, to live a more satisfying life. Let me get my mouse to show up again. If anybody could tell me why this hides my mouse, it's really annoying. But first, don't fear God. Step one. You can see the shadows of the next ones there in the PowerPoint. But the first one is don't fear God. All right. So I'm not. This is what Epicurus said. Don't say I'm saying this. His first thing is don't fear God. All right. What else? Don't worry about death. Okay. Why, Epicurus? Why not worry about death? Epicurus was, I think, the first person to express this sentiment. But when he was asked about death, he said something. I'm paraphrasing. I was not. I was. I will be not, I care not. And that idea of like, there was a time where I didn't exist, and then I existed, and then there will be a time where I don't exist, and I won't care that I don't exist. That is word for word, or sentiment for sentiment, Roger Ebert, the movie reviewer, his expression of his impending death, or his concern for his impending death. Roger Ebert contracted, I think it was throat cancer. He was ghastly the last few years of his life, where he had to have surgery and he wore a scarf all the time, and he couldn't speak anymore. He lost his voice, and you'd think that would, in a way, tenderize somebody or make them more thoughtful about death. And he said, well, it'll be back to where I was before I was born. I'll just be nothing. So if you want to live a better life, don't fear God. All right, doesn't exist. Don't worry about death, because once you're dead, you're not going to worry about it. There's nothing you can do about it, and you'll just kind of not care. So that's part two of Epicurus's 4-part remedy here. What is good is easy to get. What is good is... Now, I disagree. I think a lot of people disagree with Epicurus here. But Epicurus is saying, go for what is good. And if anything is incredibly difficult to get, then it's probably not good. What is good is easy to get. What is terrible is easy to endure. So you can endure terrible things. It's almost an Eastern way of thinking, this idea of stress or suffering is a temporary thing. You'll get through it, and it's really just in your mind. So if you want to live a better life, don't fear God. Don't worry about death. Remember, what is good is easy to get. What is terrible is easy to endure. It's not quite Stoicism. Epicurus was an opponent of Stoicism. He wasn't saying have a stiff upper lip, but rather he was saying just pursue pleasure. Do not worry about the abstract. Worry about right now, and don't even worry about it. Just live. And you can see then where we've inherited a lot of this mindset. The mindset of don't worry about life, or don't worry about what happens after. Seek happiness now in moderation. Don't be a jerk about it, but seek after your own well-being and seek after the well-being of others. And basically what ethics becomes is how can we create the most good for the most people, which is utilitarianism, but the most well-being for the most people. So what makes the most people feel good? So, I mean, you can apply this to politics if you want. People do. But basically, how do you get the most people to vote for you? Well, promise them that you'll make them feel good. No politician that I can remember has ever run on this idea of like, we need to tighten our belts. We need to put our nose to the grindstone and we just need to work hard for a few years. No. Politicians sound more like commercials. You deserve a vacation. You deserve something better. You deserve a reward for all your hard work. And maybe you do. But that idea, it comes from this Epicurean philosophy. We deserve pleasure. We should seek pleasure. And we should shy away from suffering and pain as much as possible. So that's such a prevalent thought that it's basically a priori. It's basically the default setting. You have to kind of defend. If you don't believe that, you have to really defend your beliefs. People will accept Epicureanism on its face. So how did Epicurus get to here? Or to the question of the problem of evil? Well, this philosopher from the 18th century, David Hume, he dug Epicurus up, so to speak, and reformulated his question about evil into this statement, which is really the problem of evil in a nutshell. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? then he is malevolent or bad. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil? Or from where does evil come? It's a question that people ask today. And it might be phrased as such: if God is all good and all powerful, why is there evil? Okay. If he is all good and not all powerful, then he's not able to stop evil. Okay, that's why there's evil. So he's not all good, or he is all good, but he's not all powerful. He's not able to. Well, he's not God then, if he's not all powerful. If he is all powerful but not all good, then he does not want to stop evil. And that's probably a worse situation. That's one where, if there's an all powerful God who hates us, then why would he want to stop evil? Why wouldn't he want to make us suffer? Therefore, in a universe that contains evil, God cannot be all powerful and all loving. It's incompatible, or it would be a contradiction. And thus, the problem of evil, it's a problem for theists or a problem for Christians. It would not be a problem for a skeptic. A skeptic would say the existence of evil, the evidence we have of evil, is evidence that there is no God. Now, I'm doing a half-baked argument there, because you can already see how you can pull the threads of that argument and it falls apart. But this question that started, years and years ago, was probably first formulated by Epicurus, was reformulated by David Hume, the Enlightenment philosopher who really didn't like the idea of religion and God in general. But philosophers have a way of getting into Saturday morning cartoons, or at least into movies. And I'll explain this for a second. This is an idea that comes from Francis Schaeffer. And if you've read Francis Schaeffer, you probably already know where I'm going. If you haven't read Francis Schaeffer, he's incredibly accessible. He has some detractors, and definitely I'll be the first to admit that Schaeffer in his later years started going a little bit off, into left field. But when Francis Schaeffer was at his peak, it was pretty amazing stuff to read. But he presented this idea that we as Christians should be aware of philosophy. We should read philosophy. We should be very aware of what current thinkers say, what ancient thinkers said, because those ideas eventually end up in pop culture. Those ideas will eventually be taught to your children in some preschool exercise. That no philosopher would walk in and teach a child that, but it gets there eventually. And how does it do that? Well, the way he tracked it, and I don't have a graphic for this, I should have drawn it, but imagine that, philosophy is up here in the abstract. It just exists up here above where many people are spending their days. And philosophy really is abstract. The reason that philosophy is so difficult to read is because these guys are trying to come up with ideas that people haven't said yet. And they're trying to use language that hasn't already been used. Because if you're using language that's already been used, then maybe you're just you're using the dictionary to define words in the dictionary. And at some point, you're just referring to, okay, what does just mean? Oh, okay, righteous. Well, what does righteous mean? You eventually get back to just. It's circular. So philosophers try to come up with new language, new ways of thinking. They don't use a lot of comparisons. The reason Nietzsche is so popular is because he used a lot of comparisons, which probably makes him a bad philosopher, but it makes him a great teacher and thinker, because people can grab onto what he's saying. So high philosophy, though, is very hard to communicate to the average person. Well, this is where artists come in. So Schaeffer has this kind of chart of let's say philosophy starts up here. We're over here with philosophy, right? It's up here. And the art community of Paris has been reading certain philosophers. And this one particular artist is like, this inspires me to paint. I'm not sure what I'm trying to, but I think I'm going to paint something that just looks slightly off. And they paint something impressionistic, because they really believe, it looks pretty, but also that our grip on reality is like this. Like, what is reality? And, these ideas that, yeah, maybe they're thinking that, maybe not, but the people that see the artwork start understanding, like, oh, yeah, maybe reality is just shimmering. There's no defined edges to reality. Like, these ideas start to take hold in the artistic community. Then you might have a musician who wants to compose a piece, and the piece is very atonal. The piece is very, it doesn't sound great to the average ear, but to certain people in the art community, it's like, wow, I get it. Yeah, like, life doesn't really make sense. The way this music doesn't make sense. And then that music and that art inspires a writer of short stories or a writer of stories, and they write a story about somebody's life that doesn't really make sense, and how and life is so arbitrary, and how the worst things can happen to you, and you'll never know why. And we're already arriving to things you might have heard of already. The Stranger by Camus, the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. These kind of quasi-philosophical stories, which are easy to grasp, even though they have a lot of philosophical subtext. Dostoevsky had a lot of philosophical subtext. So they're starting to apply these concepts to life, because the concepts have been trying to describe life. And eventually those stories are read by somebody who is making, in modern times, a movie or a television show. Let's say they make a movie, and this movie becomes really popular, and everybody watches this movie about just dissatisfaction with life, and how you really just ought to go for what feels good, because life really doesn't make sense. And you call that movie The Graduate, and everybody watches the movie. And people start to be able to put words to this kind of distress they have. That were, first, there was a philosopher trying to describe what this stuff was, and really not doing a good job of it, but people kept interpreting him and processing him, digesting him, until you could watch a movie about it. And then somebody watches that movie and they're inspired to write something, and they write a Saturday morning cartoon about how in the end, what really matters is your friends. In the end, what really matters is your friends is an Epicurean idea. Epicurus literally said that. Now, we all think it's just a natural idea that everybody thinks. But no, it's an Epicurean idea. And it's made its way through thousands of years, being interpreted and reinterpreted to the point where it just ends up being a truism for Saturday morning cartoons. So the example I've come up with, and this is a much reviled movie, I think, by a lot of people, but I happen to enjoy this movie. This is from Batman versus Superman. I'm not going to show a clip because last week Facebook hammered me and took my video down for showing a 2-minute clip, which was fair use, by the way, but I'm not going to try to argue with that anymore. But I'm going to describe this scene from the movie. This was from Batman versus Superman. It came out a couple of years ago. I'm sorry if you didn't like this movie. It wasn't that bad, folks. They can't all be the Avengers. But there is a climactic scene in which Lex Luthor confronts Superman, and he's got him kind of pinned. I'm not, spoilers, whatever. But Superman's trapped. Lex Luthor's been using kryptonite, Superman's only weakness. And Lex Luthor makes this comment. See, what we call God depends on our tribe. Clark Joe, calling Superman Clark Kent. Because God is tribal. God takes sides. No man in the sky intervened when I was a boy to deliver me from my daddy's fists and abominations. I figured out way back, if God is all powerful, he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, then he cannot be all powerful. And neither can you. Now, we can discuss why is this in a comic book movie? Like you're taking your 10-year-old to see this. And you have a character who's basically just quoting David Hume. But Superman, the character, has brought up a lot of those philosophical questions for people. And the movies try to explore that. And I think it's valuable. Superman's presented as a Christ figure. And originally, Superman, when he was created, was kind of a Moses figure. Superman's creators were Jewish, and he was a Moses kind of character. But he has been reinterpreted in many ways as a Christ figure. He's able to do all these amazing things, and he has a love for mankind. He's an alien from another world that's come to be a human. He looks just like us. It's not a perfect analogy. But in the movies, they really try to make Superman look like this tortured soul. Like he wishes he could do more, but he can only be in so many places at the same time. So part of the resentment that people have for Superman is, why didn't you save us? And Lex Luthor then says that as Superman's dealing with this God complex that he has, Lex Luthor says, like, no, you can't be like God, because there is no God. God can't be all powerful and all good, because when I was a boy, my dad beat me. It comes from a very emotional place for Lex Luthor. When I was a boy, my dad beat me, and God didn't come help me. God was, I guess, part of my dad's tribe. So God was on his side. So God is not all loving and all powerful, and neither is Superman. Now, that is a crushing idea if you're a 10-year-old who loves Superman or God, I guess. But for many people, that would be their introduction to this question. Imagine that. Imagine not ever thinking about this or being able to articulate it in that way until you see it in a movie. Sure, you might have sensed it. You might have sensed, like, why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God let that happen? But then to hear a character say it just like that really does open the door for a lot of people, a lot of young people, to start doubting and start almost uncritically doubting. They don't interrogate the question at all. They just go straight to, like, oh, God must not exist if that's true. So before we can talk about evil, though, I want to kind of do a little dissection of evil, a taxonomy of evil. So what do we mean when we say evil? So let's just pose the question. If God's all good and all powerful, then why does evil exist? All right? It's really the best question. It's the only question. If God is all good and all powerful, why does evil exist? And I'm not going to go into every possible rebuttal to that, but we have to explore it a little bit to know what we're talking about. So some of the first concept to address, and I'm not saying address this for the person asking you, but have this in mind. What kind of evil are you talking about? Evil how? The two categories of evil that are found in philosophy and in apologetics are moral evil, which is murder, purposeful, malevolent, like a person doing a bad thing, a person willing a bad thing to happen. The second category is natural evil, a hurricane, an earthquake, an act of God that is not a fault of a person. Now, act of God is a term used even by atheists. It's just to say that there's a non-personal cause for this evil. Moral evil and natural evil. So let's investigate each of those. Moral evil. And you'll see there, that's a picture of, you can probably guess. It's from a concentration camp. I'm not sure which. And those are children. Those are children in a concentration camp. That is probably the most heinous moral evil that anyone can name. And you could probably name other genocides. But it's hard to wrap your mind around how evil the Hitler and the Nazis were. But moral evil is not impossible. It's not hard for us to understand moral evil. Almost intuitively, we can understand that people are evil, or people are sometimes evil. So where does moral evil come from? According to the Bible, according to Christianity, moral evil comes from man's rebellion against God in Genesis 3. The fall of man. I'm not going to go over it now. I think we've talked about it before. But sin was introduced into the world through the fall of man, which is when man and woman deliberately disobeyed God. They used their free will to disobey God. And they brought in a separation between man and God. And all manner of evil came from that. Their children, Cain and Abel, Cain tried to kill Abel out of pure jealousy. So the first family had really serious problems. And in a lot of ways was, we inherited those genes, so to speak. So there's this idea in the Bible and in theology that we inherit sin, or we inherit this sinful nature. Put it that way. I'm not saying that you inherited your great-grandfather's, the bad things he did, but rather you inherited the same sinful nature that he had, the same capacity and the same bent towards evil. So everyone is born totally depraved. I'll explain that in a moment, and capable of evil. Total depravity is a doctrine of Reformed theology, of Calvinism, which you can look up later if you want to. Tulip. It's the 5 points of Calvinism. Calvinism is much deeper and broader than Tulip, but Tulip's easy to remember. Total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. Whether you know it or not, you have been taught that at some form, or you've been taught the opposite of that. That is really has directed a lot of how people think about God. But total depravity doesn't mean that you're the worst you could be. It just means every part of you is tainted by sin. So your relationships, the way you think about your possessions, the way you think about your parents, the way, like every sphere of life that you have, sin taints it somehow. So you're not as bad as you could be. You could be much worse. By the grace of God, you're not. But there is no part of you that is free from sin or from this sense of brokenness and willful rebellion. In the verse I have there, Psalm 51:5. Psalm 51 is a famous psalm by King David after he's discovered to having slept with Bathsheba and having her husband killed. That's David for you. He repents. He's duly sorry and repent. He turns away from his sin. But he says in this poem, and it's a poem, he's not trying to write theology, but he says in this poem that surely I was sinful from the moment my mother conceived me. Now, David is indicating there, again, he's not writing theology, but David is indicating there, he's thinking about, how is it that I was capable of doing this? It must be that I was born this way. It must be that this is just part of who I am. And later on in the book of Romans, Paul would explore this idea of, yeah, you are born that way. Just because you're born that way doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. If you have evil inclinations, doesn't mean they're the right thing just because you feel like doing them. But we're all capable of evil. And that one way I've put it to students is, and I'm pretty sure I stole this from John Calvin. So I have two daughters, and one is only 6 months old, and she's already a big 6-month-old. She's hefty, and she's cute. She's hefty, but she's cute. Every now and then she'll like grab something and just drop it. She'll kick you and all that, but she's a baby. But if my 6-month-old daughter was 6 feet tall, she would be thrown in prison. That she would be arrested immediately. She would be a monster. People will not allow her to exist with society. It's just because she's so small and weak that we find her cute. But really, and this is Calvin, if a baby could, they would claw off their mother's breast, or that might be Augustine actually. They would claw off their mother's breast for its milk. So we're all capable of horrible things, and then we're also capable of justifying those actions and wanting to do those things as we develop our conscience. So that's already contra a lot of modern day philosophy. People like to think that people are born naturally good, or maybe some people are good, some people are bad. I think if you spend 5 minutes in Miami traffic, everybody's evil. You get it. And the idea of free will. So I'm going to take a hard left or right, I'm not sure here. If you watch apologetics videos or presentations, when people talk about the problem of evil, they will usually pin it on free will. They'll say something like this. Well, God wanted us to have free will. God wanted it to give us the choice to do good or to do bad. So some people do bad. Now, if God made us incapable of doing bad, and therefore there would be no moral evil, then we would all be robots. So that's how God, for the sake of giving us free will, then allowed evil to exist. A lot of very famous and smart apologists say that. I'm not trying to say I know more than them. They know way more than me, and they've talked about this way more. But there's a part of that just doesn't sit with me. Sit well with me, because this is gonna sound weird, takes God off the hook. It's almost like God saying like, hey man, that's on you. You do you. Like God, I'm just gonna sit back here and watch. It almost becomes, if followed to its natural end, and this is my thinking about it, then what you end up with is either deism, a God that's kind of removed and doesn't really care, or you end up with something called open theism. Open theism is a recent liberal Christian doctrine. Open theism kind of goes like this. God doesn't really know what he's doing, and he doesn't really know where this is going. But he's going to love us. He's going to do everything he can, but he's not all powerful, and he really isn't, gonna bail us out or anything like that. So open theism, again, kind of takes God off the hook. And says, hey, he's just like one of us, but a little bigger. But at the same time, makes him not God. So I think when you go, let me readjust my camera. When you go down that path of God just gave us all free will, if you go down far enough, you either end up at a place where God doesn't care, or he's so far removed, and what he really cared about was giving us free will, in which case he doesn't need to be around, or God doesn't really know where this is going. Now, I believe the opposite of those two things. And I'm not trying to caricature that view. I'm just saying that's kind of where my mind goes when I think about that. I think the opposite of those two. I think God knows exactly where all this is going. And I think God is very involved. So if those two things are true, then he did not just give us free will, and then because he gave us free will, a consequence of it is sin. Because I believe we have free will, but we have free will to sin. And this is, I don't have verses up there, but Paul talks about this, I believe in 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, this idea of that our mind is darkened. In Ephesians 2, he talks about the fact that we are spiritually dead in our trespasses, meaning we're basically like zombies. we are carrying out the desires of our flesh. We're carrying out the desires of the world. We're carrying out the desires of our own heart. And all these things are bent towards selfishness, ultimately. Any good that we do is by the grace of God until we're converted, until the Holy Spirit gives us a new heart, brings us up from the dead. And then we're able not to sin. We're able to do good things on purpose. It doesn't mean we're incapable of sinning. It just means we're able to say no to it. But the unconverted person only has free will to sin. They will never choose God. There's no one who seeks righteousness, not even one. I'm just quoting Paul, and Paul's just quoting the Old Testament. So moral evil then, to kind of put a little pin on this for the moment, moral evil is the consequence of the fact that we live in a world where the fall happened. And I'm going to come back to, well, why did God let the fall happen? We'll come back to that in a second, don't worry. But it's a consequence of living in a place where sin has entered. And everyone's heart is bent towards sin. It's not to say everyone's as evil as it could be. Not even to say that everyone's disgusting or repudiating or whatever. It's just saying that we are capable of evil, and it should not surprise us. Nobody holds lions culpable for killing gazelles. They don't say it's evil. They say it's part of being a lion. Humans are the only creature where we say that killing another person, in many cases, is just, it's not justified, especially to eat them. You know, if a lion kills a gazelle to eat them, it's like, that's just nature. But if a person kills a person, or you know, a lot of people say if a person kills an animal to eat them, you know, that's evil somehow. Like, why do we hold ourselves to that standard? We're going to get to that. The next category of evil that I mentioned was natural evil. That a picture there, you'll see that's a painting of the Lisbon earthquake. Maybe you've heard of this earthquake, maybe you haven't. But the Lisbon earthquake happened on November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. That's a Catholic festival, a feast day. There was an 8.5 earthquake, a few hundred miles off of the shore of Portugal, and which was felt in Lisbon immediately. Then after that earthquake, a tsunami hit, and because there were so many candles being lit to celebrate All Saints' Day, and all those candles were knocked over by the earthquake, and the tsunami did not put out the fires, not all of the fires, there was also a fire. So Lisbon was hit with an earthquake, a tsunami, and a fire in the same day while they're celebrating All Saints' Day. Killed 50,000 people in one day. That's just an estimate. But 50,000 people gone in a matter of hours, maybe less. So naturally, philosophers asked, Voltaire was one of the most famous philosophers asking this question, what possible reason could God have to do this? And he didn't just, you know, it's not like he just picked something out of a hat, like, oh, something bad happened. Why did God let that happen? No, like, why did Lisbon get this? Why not Paris? In Paris, they're dancing right now. Like, Lisbon is 10 times more holy and God-loving than Paris. Why did God do this to Lisbon? So this created a conundrum, or this problem of evil came to the forefront for a lot of people in Europe at that time, because they really did not have a good way of explaining why would God let this happen. If it had happened to a bad city, then the people might have said, well, that's just their due punishment. That's just what they deserved. And it's a consequence of their sin. God has punished them. And you'll hear people say similar things today. So that, you know, this is Victor opinion time. I can't stand when people try to pull out of a hat the reason for why something bad happened. All right? Jesus didn't do that. When Jesus was presented with situations where people wanted to know, why did this bad thing happen? There's twice I can think of off the top of my head. One was the collapse of the Tower of Siloam. This is in Luke, I want to say Luke 8, Luke 12, somewhere around there, where Jesus mentions this tower collapse, killed some people. And he says, like, don't worry about why it happened, but think you're going to die one day. So where are you going to go? Repent. Jesus uses it as an example. They just to bring forward the idea of, like, hey, you're going to die one day. Another example, when this is in John 9, when Jesus heals a man born blind, and the disciples ask him, why was this man born blind? Was it his sin or his father's sin? And Jesus says, no, this man was born blind so that that God might be glorified through him. And Jesus heals him. So Jesus says somehow God had orchestrated this man's genes in some way that he be born blind so that Jesus could heal him as an adult. Like, I had no idea that was going to happen for the first 30, 40 years of his life. But Jesus heals him as an adult. And he's like, this guy was born blind for this very moment so that could be glorified. And that doesn't answer the disciples' questions. Like, so whose sin was it? Jesus is like, it doesn't matter. It matters that God is glorified. So when catastrophes happen and the news finds whatever gas bag to go out there and say, oh, I'll tell you whose fault it was. Like, that's not how Jesus would address it. But people have this natural tendency to try to assign blame to whatever happens, whether it be to God or to the government or to a particular person or a particular practice. People try to assign blame. So for Europeans at that time, they're trying to figure out, like, who do we blame for this? How do we blame God? Now, here's how to deal with natural evil. And I'm not trying to say how to deal with natural evil so that, you sweep it under the rug. But natural evil, and this is the contention I'm making here, natural evil is just moral evil on a larger scale. What do I mean by that? Take the example of the Black Plague or the bubonic plagues. Now, they more than decimated Europe. I forgot the number, like maybe a third of Europe died. But most Jewish people survived. Why? Because Jewish people they wash their hands. They're very clean people. There's something that they did that helped them to survive, which meant that bubonic plague was not necessarily going to kill a third of all people if more people had known to wash their hands. Now, I'm not saying it's their fault for not knowing to wash their hands. The germ theory didn't exist yet. But that is to say, like, why was a certain group spared? Now, bring that to a different context. Why are lifespans shorter in poor countries? Is it because they're bad? Because they're bad people? No, they have less access to healthcare, water, food, basic things that we take for granted in Western society and developed countries. Now, do we say it's their fault for not having medicine and water and food? No. We'll typically find an African warlord, a corrupt government, somebody in power somewhere who has deprived certain people of their ability to survive. Now, bring it up in a grander scale. Or more modern example, Hurricane Andrew. Hurricane Andrew did a lot of devastation in South Florida. But it especially devastated the community of Country Walk. And what they found in Country Walk was that, and I was only 10 years old when this happened, so I don't know all the details, but basically that the buildings were made out of garbage. The buildings were not up to code. They were not up to snuff. They were not made to withstand anything. So Country Walk suffered more devastation because someone somewhere was being morally evil. Now, I can make a long argument for why I think hurricanes are actually a natural occurrence. Hurricanes are not a sign of the fall, in my opinion, or in my understanding of the Bible. The hurricanes help regulate the temperature of the oceans. Hurricanes exist for a reason. Hurricanes are only evil when they destroy and they kill. But they don't destroy and kill where there isn't anybody to destroy or kill. And they also destroy and kill less in communities that have been able to brace for them, either through proper building or through proper resources. So what am I saying with all this? On the one hand, don't build your house on the side of a volcano. All right, the volcano will erupt. So, we might be saying in 50 years, we shouldn't have built anything here in Miami. Who knows? But right now we live here. On the other hand, make sure that there are not people expressing moral evil, whether through a system of some sort or through their own personal power, that deprives people of the ability to withstand these kinds of events. Because even a simple rainstorm could kill somebody if they have nowhere to seek shelter. So there is, and this goes way deeper than that, and I wish I could spend more time talking about this, but all that to say, my point being that natural evil, if no one existed, there would be no such thing as natural evil. Hurricanes, earthquakes would just happen. They're tectonic plates rubbing each other. But we know that God sends them. In the Bible, it tells us God sends earthquakes. God sends storms. He does certain things on purpose. True. But not everything, according to Jesus, not everything is designated to be some sort of punishment. Some things happen for a different purpose. And they could be revealing to us that we're asking the wrong questions. They could be revealing to us that there is a moral evil that we have not addressed that would lessen the natural evil that we see. There's a moral evil we have not addressed that might lessen the natural evil that we perceive. So those comments of evil and question still remains. Why is there evil? We're not going to get to sin and hell tonight. I'm just going to tell you right now. There's no way to get to sin and hell with the way I've spent our time. But this is a beefy topic, so it deserves an hour. The question remains, why is there evil? All right? Like, if evil exists because Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree, why did God put the tree in the garden? And I'll tell you right now, if your teenager hasn't asked this question, they thought it. All right? This is not a new question, but every time I've heard it, the feeling I get is that this person thinks that they are the first person ever to ask this question. And it seems to be a showstopper for a lot of people. They'll get on board with like, okay, God exists, but why did he leave the tree in the garden? Like, why did he set all this up? Why did he set up this house of cards? What, did he not know that was going to happen? And if he didn't know it was going to happen, then how is he God? And if he wanted it to happen, then how is he good? Why would he why would he put us through all that? That just seems abusive. So you have to address the question honestly. That's the kind of question where I think a lot of people would shy away and say like, oh, well, we don't know, or God, it's a mystery of God. Well, which could sound like a cop-out, could also be true. You don't know. It might be a mystery. But from what we see written throughout the Bible, now what is the Bible? The Bible's a story. All right? It's a meta-narrative. It's a big story that contains all the other stories. And what makes the Bible better than all the other stories and all the big stories that people try to present is that the Bible is a story that actually happened. It's a story that's true. All right, we all have our favorite. I love Lord of the Rings. Man, I love Lord of the Rings. But I know it's not true. Whatever value I get from it is just a value that I've invented for myself. But what if it was true? What if it actually happened? Then not only is it some kind of sentimental value I've taken for myself, but it's a value that can be written into the universe. That it's a part of the fabric of us, of what is and what morality is. So the story that God has written is a story of redemption. The story of the Bible is a story of redemption and restoration. If God is all-knowing and all-loving and all-powerful, he must have found redemption and restoration a more beautiful and more glorifying story. Now, let me put that in different words in case you missed it. If God's able to see everything that would ever happen, all right, and nothing surprises him, all right, I'm not even arguing for, I believe in foreordination. I believe God has foreordained whatever comes to pass. That you can't lose a hair off the top of your head and God didn't plan it. I don't believe God's the author of sin and evil, but I do believe that he knows what's going to happen. And he has planned things to happen. He has planned things to be a certain way. He has the end in mind. He's already written the end of the story, and we are merely living it. Here are two things that are true. One, any book you've ever read. All right, and maybe you have a favorite author, maybe you have a most hated author. I don't know why you'd read books by your most hated author, but I hate Jane Austen. I read one of her books, and now I know why I hate Jane Austen. Sorry, Jane Austen fans. I'm reminded of a Mark Twain quote. Any library would be made better if it was rid of all Jane Austen books, even if it had no other book. What was I saying? Anyways, you might disagree with the decisions the author made in his book. But you would never say that the author does not have the authority to write those things in his book. It's his book. He's writing the story. So you might disagree with the decisions he's made, but it's his story to write. If it was our story to write and he's taking the book from us and is writing it, then yes, we should do everything we can to get the book out of his hands and rewrite it. But he is writing the story. We're a part of it. We're not responsible for writing it. We're responsible for living it. We cannot skip to the end. We have a preview of the end, but we are living through the story. And the tapestry, so to speak, of the events that happen. We might not see in the moment how those things can be beautiful or restorative in any way, but God does, because God knows the whole story. And he thought about how the story could go, and he found that the story of redemption and restoration, the story where everything goes wrong and then everything goes right, was a more beautiful story to tell. And you believe that too, because I swear every movie I've ever seen is that story. Every romantic comedy, I hate romantic comedies, but every romantic comedy, at some point, this happens. There's a misunderstanding between, the boy and the girl, and all of a sudden the boy has to set things right, and the girl comes back. Right? Almost all of them go that way, because there has to be a conflict. If it was just a story of how two people met and fell in love, you would vomit all over that movie. If there was an adventure story about how there was a king and nothing bad ever happened, and then he went to sleep, that's not a story. But somehow we've found those kinds of stories beautiful. So we live those kinds of stories as well. And living in them is a lot more difficult. I'm not going to say it's easy and beautiful. It's a lot more difficult. But I have to imagine God has found that story to be more beautiful. And it's a story that he is telling. And I can ask him when I meet him, why did you do that? Why that way? He doesn't have to explain himself to me. If God had to explain himself to me, then I'm his boss, and I'm God. And if I'm God, I've been doing a horrible job. So I'm going to let God be God. God is not the author of sin and evil, but he uses sin and evil for good, our good, and glory, his glory. An example of this that we see is in Genesis 50, and specifically Genesis 50:20. And I'll summarize the story. It's a story of Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and through a crazy course of events, ends up becoming the vice king, the vice pharaoh of a neighboring country, Egypt, where his brothers have to go years later to go and find food to eat because there's been a famine, and only Egypt has stored up food. And they go see him, and they don't recognize him. Why would their brother, who they sold into slavery, be second in command of Egypt? And finally, Joseph reveals who he is, and they are scared. Wouldn't you be? Like, oh, our brother who we totally betrayed is now really powerful. What is he going to do to us? How is he going to punish us? And Joseph says these beautiful words. What you did, you meant for evil, but God used it for good. You meant it for evil, but God used it for good. There can be moral evil that God uses for good, and God not be the cause or the author of that evil. There can be decisions that people make to be evil that God somehow uses for good. And I'm not going to sit here and try to apply it to everything that's ever happened. There are some atrocious things that have happened in history that I've struggled with. How on earth is that going to be good in anything? How is that glorifying at all? If anything, it just shows that, man, the good is going to have to be really good because the evil's been really evil. So here are some questions or some ways to address somebody who's asking these kinds of questions. And these are when you ask somebody questions, don't interrogate them. If they're actually suffering through this or if they're suffering in evil, but try to help them explore why they have this question. First, ask if they had something personal happen or if they mean evil in general. So if their father died and they say, what are bad things? Don't try to have a philosophical treatise with them. Just hug them. Tell them that you feel their pain. So ask, is this something personal that happened? Is it something emotional or just had this idea? Most of the time, people think of this question when they've had something bad happen. When they have some kind of feeling like God was not there. If it's personal, explore how God himself is familiar with suffering. So that's kind of called the cruciform theodicy. What did I just say? Basically, how we justify evil or how we justify God through the cross. So what does that mean, cruciform theodicy? In the cross, we see God suffering. Jesus Christ is suffering on the cross. His human nature is being beat. And his divine nature is experiencing some level of anguish. And you're not going to go into all the philosophical conundrums of that. What does that mean? The impassibility of God. But rather, God is familiar with suffering to an extent. We're told in the book of Hebrews. He's tempted in every way we were tempted, but did not sin. We don't have a high priest. We don't have a savior who does not know what suffering is. So if you've ever felt betrayed, so did Jesus. If you've ever felt that everyone turned their back on you, yeah, so did Jesus. If you've ever physically been hurt, so was Jesus. If you've ever been heartbroken, so was Jesus. Like all God has experienced these things as well. And that might not answer for you why a bad thing happened, but that is a better answer than, well, there's just no God. You're left with way more questions with that one. Or there is a God and he's evil. Oh, that's great. Then there's really nothing we can do. But the Bible presents to us a God who's familiar with suffering, as a man of sorrows, well acquainted with grief, as it says in Isaiah. If it's general, if they're like, well, I just don't get why does evil exist in general, then you can ask them like, hey, where did good and evil come from? Where do you get your idea of good and evil? Like, by what standard, to be a little presuppositional with them, by what standard are you evaluating God? You're basically holding God's feet to the flame according to a standard that God gave you. So if you want to go around saying that was bad, that was evil, like, why? Oh, because people were hurt. Why is it wrong to hurt people? Oh, because you can just keep going and going and going. It's like, ultimately, you have to come to a place where you have to say something like, well, it just is. Or we're given dignity by God. Or things just shouldn't be that way. Says who? Like it's like going to the lion and saying, why did you kill that gazelle? It's like, because I'm a lion. That's what I'm supposed to do. Why does a human have to act differently? So these, and again, if somebody's emotionally experiencing this, don't throw that on them. But if they're having a kind of intellectual discourse, you can say, where do you get that concept? And they might have a good answer for it, of where they get their concept of good and evil. But typically, it'll be a descendant of Epicureanism. It'll be some kind of idea of like, well, it just makes people feel bad. And if something feels bad, then it is bad, which kind of presents another problem, because there are people who enjoy feeling bad. There are good things that feel bad. So I think we agree that eating vegetables is good and healthy. It makes you live longer. That don't feel good. So we kind of have to come to a place of like, where do exactly would you get these standards that we're evaluating God by? The next question. Point them to who the God of the Bible is. All right? Because I want to get this across. If God is big enough to blame, he's big enough to have reasons. And he doesn't need to explain that to you. All right? I'm not trying to make God an ogre. I'm not trying to say like, well, God doesn't have to. God can be cold and indifferent. He's not a personification of a cold and indifferent universe. But rather, if God is just a guy who's like a little farther up than us, if God is just like on the top floor of this building, then man, what a jerk. If God is just one of us who's a little more powerful, then he's like any bad dictator or any bad whatever. Like anytime something happens that's wrong, you can be like, what a horrible blank, governor, what a horrible dictator, what a horrible boss, what have you. But that's a concept of God that is not found in the Bible. God is not just a little further up than us. God is not just somebody who's been around long enough that he got the title of God. And now he's just kind of like barely putting things together and, making mistakes here and there. God's not Superman. God is so much further up than Superman. There's a song I like, Jesus is My Superhero. It's a song for kids. I like that song a lot. But Jesus is way higher than a superhero. He only shares certain qualities with superheroes. So if God is so far above, and his mind is so great, and he has so much knowledge, and he has all of these things that we say we hold him accountable because he's so big, then maybe he has reasons that we don't know or could not understand because he's so big. He's 3D, we are 2D. Now, it's not an incredibly satisfying answer because we still don't have an answer. But it does present us with this kind of refresher or this kind of cup of water in the face of like, who do you think you're talking about? And if God's on trial here, who's the judge? If we're the judge, like God's not just a bigger form of government, government by consent of the governed. That's the American way. Yeah, we didn't elect God. God's not responsible to us. And God has a will, and he'll exercise it however he pleases. That sounds really cold, right? But what has he done with that will? He's revealed it to us. He's told us who he is. He's offered his son to us. He's offered us salvation. God has offered us a relationship with him where He didn't need to. Could have started all this over, scrapped it. But he's offered us that relationship. Now, I can't dive too far into that because we're running out of time. And last, point them to God's unfair, gracious love. Romans 5:6-8. I'll paraphrase it. Somebody would die for a good and righteous person. Somebody would dare to die for that. But who would die for evil people? Who would die for sinners? Who would die for the ungodly? God would. That is so unfair. The people who deserve nothing getting everything. The person who deserved everything, Jesus Christ, getting punishment. That is so unfair to God and gracious to us. And God is gracious because he wants to be gracious. He's not gracious because we deserve his grace. That wouldn't be grace. That'd be like saying you deserve a gift that you got. There's a story of, I'll close with a verse after this. You can find this video online of this girl who had collapsed while she was running a race. And another runner, I think this is a high school race or maybe college race, another runner picked her up, literally, and ran her to the finish line. Now, you'd think, what a wonderful story. Man, put that on 60 Minutes, that'll go viral. But then in the interview after the race, she doesn't say, I'm so thankful for that person that, she didn't have to help me. She doesn't say, like, oh, by the grace of God. No, she says, I knew I was going to finish that race no matter what. What? That wasn't you. That wasn't you at all. Why do you think you were going to finish that race no matter what? No, you weren't. It took somebody intervening for you to finish that race. So we have to remember who God is, who we are. And that's not going to always be a satisfying answer to evil, wise or evil. But God is big enough that he has his reasons. God somehow saw this story as being more beautiful, and at some point, we will agree. And God himself is familiar with suffering and evil. God is familiar with that. Whatever rules he's asked us to live by, he has lived by himself. Whatever he's asked us to endure, he has endured himself. Why did he do it another way? I don't know. But he's doing it a certain way on purpose. And that is a much more satisfying answer. That helps me sleep at night. More than saying there is no God. It's a pitiless, indifferent universe. How does that help? Then you still have evil. And you now have zero explanation for it. So I want to finish with some scripture. This is from the book of Isaiah, Old Testament book. This is a prophecy about what happens at the end. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. And the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken. It will be said on that day, Behold, this is our God. We have waited for him, that he might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. Let us be glad indeed. Let's finish in prayer. Glorious Father, thank you so much for your revealed word to us. And Lord, help people. I'm asking. So help the people I know who deal with this question, who struggle with this question, who stay up late at night thinking about this. Remind them, Lord, if they are yours, then you stay up late at night thinking about them. Remind us, Lord, how caring you are for each of us, how much you are involved, how much you are aware of what is happening. Remind us, Lord, that whatever we find to be unjust or angering, you find to be unjust and angering. And Lord, you will one day make all things right, more right than we ever could. We ask for these blessings in your Son's holy name. Amen. All right. Good night, guys. Thanks for tuning in tonight, and I will see you next week.